The electronic chirp of the lock was the only warning before the heavy door swung inward, slicing through the quiet of the suite. I froze, my hand clutching the damp knot of the towel at my chest. The air from the hallway rushed in, cool and sharp against my bare shoulders. But the real shock wasn't the temperature. It was her. A woman stood framed in the doorway, a stack of fresh linens balanced in her arms. She didn't gasp, and she didn't scramble back in a panic. She just stopped. Her eyes, hazel, intelligent, and startlingly direct, didn't dart away in embarrassment. They locked onto mine. In that split second, the air in the room didn't just cool, it thickened. This wasn't fear. It was the sudden, terrifying clarity of being seen. My heart hammered, not like a frantic bird, but like a heavy, deliberate drum against my ribs. It was a physical thud that echoed in my ears, drowning out the low hum of the hotel's HVAC system. In Chicago, in the glass-walled boardrooms where I spent 18 hours a day, I controlled the temperature, the lighting, and the pace of every conversation. I was the architect of every interaction. Here, with water still cooling on my skin and nothing but terry cloth between me and a stranger, I was exposed. And she wasn't looking away. That was the thing that snagged in my chest, a hook catching on silk. A standard employee would have been apologizing to the carpet by now, eyes cast down in deferential panic. But this woman, Ellie, her name tag read in simple black print, held the gaze for a beat too long. It was a span of time that felt less like an accident and more like a negotiation. She took me in, not with leering disrespect, but with a calm, observant curiosity that felt infinitely more dangerous. She saw the tension in my jaw, the white-knuckle grip on the towel, and she didn't flinch. "I knocked," she said. Her voice wasn't high or nervous. It was low, a textured hum that seemed to vibrate in the sudden quiet. It wasn't an apology. It was a statement of fact. "I didn't hear you," I managed, my own voice sounding strange and thin in the charged air. Clearly, a ghost of a smile touched the corner of her mouth, not mocking, just acknowledging the absurdity of the standoff. Then, with a slow, deliberate pivot that felt entirely voluntary, she stepped back. "My mistake. I'll come back when you're settled." The door clicked shut. The sound was final, mechanical. But the energy in the room had been fundamentally altered. The silence that rushed back in wasn't the empty, sterile peace I had paid $500 a night for. It was heavy. It was waiting. I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding and sat on the edge of the bed, my legs trembling slightly. It wasn't fear. It was adrenaline, yes, but mixed with something else. A coiled tension in my stomach that felt suspiciously like anticipation. I ran a hand through my damp hair, trying to reset, trying to summon the version of myself that ran a logistics empire. I had come to this hotel to conduct a merger. Not of companies, but of a fractured self. I was trying to reconcile the Riley who executed acquisitions with surgical precision with the Riley who felt like a ghost in her own penthouse. My life in Chicago was a series of sutures, holding things together that wanted to drift apart. I was successful, respected, and entirely hollow. This trip was supposed to be a calibration, a week of silence to see if I still had a pulse underneath the tailored suits and the quarterly reports. I stood up and walked to the desk, needing to do something with my hands. I opened my laptop, the screen glowing with a familiar anesthetic blue light. I had emails to check, contracts to review, the safety blanket of bureaucracy. I started reading a clause about liability limits, forcing my eyes to track the black text on the white background. But the words kept swimming. Every time I blinked, I saw the hazel eyes. I saw the way she had stood there, grounded and unflinching, holding a stack of towels like they were part of her armor. It was like a glitch in the code of my brain. I couldn't process the data in front of me because the system was preoccupied with a new variable. The sensation was irritating, like a grain of sand in a well-oiled machine. But it was also undeniable. The room felt different now. The scent was different. Maybe it was the lavender spray housekeeping used, or maybe it was just the lingering static of another person's presence. I tried to type a response to my assistant, but my fingers hovered over the keys. The sentence structure fell apart in my head. The professional distance I usually maintained from the world felt compromised. The door was closed, locked, and bolted, but the breach had already happened. Protocol had been broken, not just by an unannounced entry, but by the way she had looked at me. Like I wasn't a guest to be served, but a puzzle to be solved. I closed the laptop with a snap, the sound echoing too loudly in the room. I couldn't work. The focus was gone, replaced by a restless energy that made my skin itch. I needed to move. I needed to reassert ownership over this space. I stood up and paced the length of the room, tightening the sash of the robe I had finally changed into. I walked to the window, looking out at the city rain blurring the glass, but the view offered no clarity. I turned back to the room, my eyes scanning the space, looking for something out of place, something to fix. That's when I saw it. On the nightstand, where I had left a stack of unread novels, my ambitious attempt at relaxation, something was different. The alignment was too perfect, the angles too sharp. Someone had touched them. And in that small, precise adjustment, I realized she hadn't just looked at me. She had been here before I was even in the room. I fled the room. I had to. The air had become too dense to breathe, saturated with the memory of that gaze. I walked the streets of Seattle for an hour, letting the damp, gray chill numb the heat that had risen in my cheeks. I marched through the Pike Place crowds, using the noise and the smell of fish and rain to ground myself, to suture the crack in my composure. I told myself I was overreacting. It was just a housekeeping mix-up, a standard error in a complex logistical system. But when I returned to the hotel, riding the elevator up in silence, the anticipation in my gut wasn't professional. It was visceral. I pressed the keycard to the door, the green light flashing like a permission slip, and stepped inside. The room had been reset. That was the first thing that hit me. Not just cleaned, but reset to a standard that felt aggressive in its perfection. The bed, which I had left a tangled mess of sheets during my restless pacing, was now made with military precision. The linens were pulled so taut a coin would bounce off them, the pillows aligned in a rigid, inviting phalanx. The air smelled faintly of lavender and something sharper, cleaner, an industrial antiseptic masked by a floral top note, the scent of erasure. I walked further in, my heels clicking on the hardwood entryway, before being muted by the plush carpet. It was the small things that stopped me. In Chicago, my housekeeper was a ghost. She came and went, leaving no trace of her own existence, only the absence of dust. Here, the presence of the cleaner, of Ellie, was stamped on every surface. On the bathroom vanity, my toiletries, which I had scattered in a rush that morning, were arranged by height. The expensive glass bottles of serum, the silver tube of mascara, the heavy jar of night cream. They stood in a disciplined line, soldier straight. It was a level of care that felt invasive. A stranger had handled these intimate objects. Her hands, the same hands that had held the linens against her chest, had touched the brush I used on my hair, the rim of the glass I drank from. The thought didn't repel me. It sent a strange liquid heat curling through my stomach. It was a phantom touch, a proxy intimacy that felt far more illicit than it should have. I moved to the desk. My laptop was exactly where I'd left it, but the chaos of charging cables I'd left snarled like a nest of vipers had been tamed. They were coiled into perfect concentric circles, tied off with small Velcro straps I didn't own. It was a correction. She was tidying my mess, imposing her order on my chaos. Then I saw it. The book I had been attempting to read, a dense, cerebral novel about architectural theory that I used more as a prop than a pastime, was sitting on the corner of the desk. It wasn't where I had left it on the nightstand, and sticking out of the top, marking a specific page, was a slip of hotel stationery. I reached for it, my fingers hesitating for a fraction of a second. This was the breach. This was the moment the professional contract dissolved completely. I pulled the paper free. The handwriting was jagged, hurried but confident, written in heavy blue ink that indented the paper. "You're skipping the best parts. The structure doesn't matter if the foundation is rotten. Try page 112. E." I stared at the note. It wasn't an apology for walking in on me. It wasn't a polite, "have a nice day." It was a critique, a challenge. She had looked at what I was reading, analyzed it, and made a judgment call about my taste, or perhaps about me. She saw the rigid, structural book I was hiding behind and called my bluff. I opened the book to page 112. It was a chapter on the collapse of brutalist facades, about how rigid structures fail when they don't account for human error. The metaphor wasn't subtle. My chest tightened, a sensation of being unzipped. This wasn't just service, it was surveillance. But not the cold security camera kind. It was the kind of observation that required attention. She had seen me, really seen me. She saw the woman in the towel, yes, but she also saw the woman trying to build a fortress out of intellectual theory and high thread count sheets. I ran my thumb over the ink of her initial. E. It felt illicit. This communication channel opened outside of protocol. A guest and a housekeeper weren't supposed to speak like this. We were supposed to be parallel lines, never intersecting. But she had just swerved across the lane. The tension that had been simmering since the doorway incident began to boil. It was a coiled, heavy feeling, a mix of irritation at her boldness and a magnetic intrigue that I couldn't suppress. She was playing a game, and for the first time in years, I didn't know the rules. I only knew that I wanted to see the player. I checked the time. Housekeeping carts were usually gone by late afternoon, retreated into the hidden service elevators and linen closets. But the note felt fresh. The ink looked wet. I grabbed my keycard. I didn't think. I didn't plan the interaction or draft a script in my head like I did for board meetings. I just knew that the room, with its perfect corners and lavender scent, suddenly felt too small to contain the question she had just asked. I needed to find the answer. I needed to find her. I stepped into the hallway, the heavy door sealing the room behind me with a pressurized thump. The corridor was a vacuum of sound, a long, carpeted throat designed to swallow footsteps and secrets. The air here was different, still cool but stagnant, recycling the same filtered oxygen that had been circulating since the building opened. It was a space of transition, a no man's land between the private sanctuary of the suites and the public performance of the lobby. And there, blocking the path like a sentinel, was the housekeeping cart. It was a fortress of linens and miniature soaps, a chaotic structure of wire and canvas that took up 2/3 of the narrow passage. Standing behind it, checking a clipboard with the tip of a pen resting against her lip, was Ellie. This was the first time I had seen her fully dressed, without the barrier of a door frame or the shock of nudity to blur the details. The uniform was tragic. A boxy, gray polyester tunic that was designed to erase the human form, paired with nondescript black trousers. It was the kind of outfit meant to render the wearer invisible, a piece of furniture that moved. But on her, the effect was the opposite. The fabric didn't hide her. It emphasized the way she refused to be hidden. She didn't slouch or shrink inside the stiff material. She occupied it. Her posture was loose but ready, a coiled alertness that suggested she was merely tolerating the uniform, not defined by it. She looked up as I approached. The recognition was instant. There was no fumbling for a name, no customer service mask sliding into place. Her hazel eyes met mine, and the air between us, already thin, seemed to snap tight. "The book was dry," she said. She didn't say hello. She didn't ask if I needed fresh towels. She picked up the conversation exactly where her note had left it, as if we had been speaking for hours. I stopped a few feet from the cart, maintaining the distance that my corporate training dictated. "It's a seminal text on structural integrity," I countered, my voice cooler than I intended. "And you defaced page 112. "I annotated it," she corrected, a small, dangerous smile playing on her lips. She capped her pen, the click sounding like a gunshot in the muffled quiet. "There's a difference. You were reading it like a manual. It's a warning. I felt a flush of irritation, but it was hot, vital. This was a negotiation. I knew how to do this. In Chicago, I negotiated million-dollar contracts. I knew how to use silence, how to leverage height and tone to assert dominance. I squared my shoulders, preparing to remind her of the hierarchy. I was the guest, the one with the platinum status. She was the staff, the one with the master key. But Ellie didn't wait for me to set the terms. She leaned back against the handle of the cart, crossing her ankles. It was a casual, almost insolent posture that dismantled my authority without saying a word. She wasn't fighting me for control. She was simply refusing to play the game by my rules. "You're Riley," she said. It wasn't a question. "You check your email at 3 a.m. and you read books about failing buildings to relax. You're not here for a vacation." "I'm here for a merger," I lied, the words slipping out automatically. "You're here to hide," she said softly. The silence that followed was thick, textured. The hum of the HVAC system seemed to drop away, leaving only the sound of my own pulse in my ears. She was too close. In the narrow hallway, the cart forced us into an intimacy that felt physical. I could smell the bleach on her cart, yes, but underneath it, I caught the scent of her, something warm and specific, like cedar and rain. It was a grounding smell, real and unpolished. She was mapping me. I could feel it. She wasn't looking at my suit or my expensive watch. She was looking at the tension in my neck, the way my hands were clenched at my sides. She was reading the subtext I spent so much energy trying to redact. "You need to get out of that room," she said, her voice dropping an octave, turning the suggestion into a conspiracy. "The air in there is recycled. You're suffocating yourself." "I have work," I said, but the defense was weak. "You have a laptop and a view of a brick wall," she countered. She reached into the pocket of her tunic, a movement that drew my eye to the curve of her hip, a detail the uniform couldn't completely suppress, and pulled out a folded coaster. She held it out to me. "There's a place on 4th, the Blue Jay. No sign, just a blue light above the door. They play jazz that sounds like it's falling apart, but never actually breaks." She waited, her hands steady in the space between us. "Go there, sit at the bar, listen to something that isn't structured." I looked at the coaster, then back at her eyes. The challenge was explicit. She was daring me to leave the safety of my meticulously curated isolation. She was daring me to step into her city, onto her terrain. "And if I don't?" I asked. Ellie shrugged, but her gaze didn't waver. It was unflinching. "Then you can go back to page 112 and read about how the walls come down eventually, anyway." I took the coaster. Our fingers didn't touch. I was careful to grab the edge. But the transfer of the object felt like an electric arc. The current was undeniable. "I'll consider it," I said, retreating to the safety of formalities. "Don't consider it," she said, pushing her cart forward, forcing me to step aside or be run over. As she passed, the wheels silent on the plush carpet, she didn't look back. "Just go." I stood alone in the hallway, the coaster rough against my thumb, watching her turn the corner. The corridor was empty again, but the static she left behind made the hair on my arms stand up. It wasn't just an invitation. It was a summons. Night had turned the floor-to-ceiling window into a black mirror, reflecting the sterile luxury of the suite back at me. I was sitting in the armchair by the corner, the laptop burning a warm rectangle against my thighs, but the cursor hadn't moved in 20 minutes. I had deliberately left the Do Not Disturb sign off the handle. It was a passive act, a silent admission that the solitude I claimed to want was actually suffocating me. When the knock came, it was soft. 2 distinct raps that sounded less like a request for entry and more like a heartbeat against the wood. "Come in," I said, my voice sounding too loud in the quiet room. The door opened and Ellie slipped inside. The hallway light cut a golden wedge across the carpet before the door clicked shut, sealing us in together. The atmosphere in the room shifted instantly. The air, which had been stagnant with the hum of electronics, suddenly felt thick, charged with a static that made the hair on my arms rise. She moved with a quiet, predatory grace, pushing a small cart that rattled softly. the only sound in the room besides the frantic thumping in my chest. "Turn down service," she said. Her voice was low, stripped of the customer service lilt she likely used for the tourists on the lower floors. For me, she used a tone that was intimate, almost conspiratorial. "I'm still working," I said, though I made no move to type. "I see that." She didn't look at me. She moved to the far side of the room, her presence a kinetic disturbance in my peripheral vision. I watched her reflection in the darkened window as she worked. It was an intimate ritual, preparing a stranger's bed for sleep. She moved with an efficiency that was mesmerizing, a practiced choreography of service that she somehow made look like a personal favor. She folded back the duvet at a precise 45-degree angle. She fluffed the pillows, her hands moving with a strength that belied the delicate task. Every rustle of the starch-stiff linens sounded like a thunderclap in the silence. She moved to the nightstand, picking up the carafe to refill the water glass. The sound of the water pouring, a clear, liquid glug, was obscenely loud. I felt hyper-aware of her location in space relative to mine. I was mapping her coordinates without looking, feeling the displacement of air as she moved closer. "You're going to burn out," she said. She didn't turn around. She was placing the glass down on a coaster, her back to me. "The screen light. It tricks your brain into thinking it's noon." "I don't have the luxury of a circadian rhythm," I replied, closing the laptop lid halfway. The blue light dimmed, leaving us in the warm, amber glow of the floor lamp. "Some of us have deadlines." Ellie turned then, leaning her hip against the heavy mahogany dresser. Her uniform was rumpled from the day's labor, a human imperfection that made her devastatingly real against the hotel's polished veneer. "Is it a deadline? Or is it a shield?" I stiffened. "Excuse me?" "You're using the work," she said, her gaze unflinching. She crossed the room toward me, not aggressively, but with a gravitational pull that was impossible to ignore. "You fill every second with data, so you don't have to listen to the silence. What are you running from, Riley?" The use of my first name, without the honorific, stripped away the last layer of professional distance. It was a breach, a suture snapping. "I'm not running," I lied. "I'm managing a transition." "You're hiding," she corrected gently. She was standing right beside the chair now. "I see it all the time. Guests check in to check out of their lives. But you're vibrating with it. You're holding yourself so tight, I'm surprised you haven't snapped." I looked up at her. The distance between us was negligible. I could see the flecks of gold in her hazel eyes, the faint shadow of fatigue under her lower lashes. The tension in the room coiled tight, a physical pressure in the center of my chest. I wanted to defend myself, to list my accolades and responsibilities, but the truth stuck in my throat. She was right. I wasn't here to merge companies. I was here because I couldn't breathe in my own life anymore. "I don't know how to stop," I whispered. It was the most honest thing I had said in a decade. Ellie didn't offer a platitude. She didn't tell me it would be okay. Instead, she reached past me, her arm extended, crossing the boundary of my personal space. For a second, I thought she was going to touch me, a hand to the shoulder, a brush of the cheek, and my breath hitched, suspended in anticipation. But she was reaching for the pillow behind my head. She placed a small, foil-wrapped chocolate on the linen, her hand lingering just inches from my face. I could feel the heat radiating from her skin, a warmth that had nothing to do with the room's thermostat. Her knuckles grazed the fabric of the chair, a hair's breadth from my shoulder. The scent of her, cedar, rain, and that clean, sharp soap filled my lungs. "The bar closes at 2, she murmured, her voice a vibration I felt in my bones. "The jazz helps. It fills the silence, so you don't have to." She pulled back, the loss of her proximity hitting me like a sudden drop in temperature. She walked to the door, the cart rattling softly in her wake. "Good night, Riley," she said, her hand on the latch. "Good night," I managed. The door clicked shut. I was alone again, but the room felt completely different. The chocolate sat on the pillow like a dare. I looked at the closed laptop, then at the coaster she had given me earlier, still sitting on the desk. The silence wasn't empty anymore. It was waiting for an answer. I stood up, my legs shaky, and moved toward the closet. I wasn't going to sleep. I was going to find the music. The address on the coaster led me to an alleyway that smelled of rain and old brick. There was no sign, just a single blue bulb caged in wire above a heavy steel door. It felt illicit, stepping out of the sanitized grid of the business district and into the veins of the city. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the handle. In my world, the world of boardrooms and high-speed elevators, everything was labeled, lit, and insured. This was a blind drop. But the memory of the hotel room, silent and suffocating, pushed me forward. I pulled the door open. The sound hit me first, a double bass line that walked heavily through the smoke-hazed air, vibrating against my ribs. The Blue Jay was narrow and dim, lit mostly by votive candles flickering in red glass jars. The crowd was a wash of shadows and low voices, a mix of locals who looked like they lived in denim and leather. I felt ridiculous. I was still wearing my silk blouse and tailored trousers, a crisp, monochromatic silhouette that screamed tourist in a room full of texture. I found a stool at the far end of the bar, trying to shrink, trying to blend into the dark wood paneling. I ordered a whiskey. Neat. I needed the burn to ground me. I was scanning the room, telling myself I was just observing the architecture, the social dynamics. But I wasn't. I was looking for her. And then I found her. She was sitting at a small round table near the small stage, her back half turned to me. The recognition wasn't immediate because the context was so violently different. The gray, boxy tunic was gone. In its place, she wore a dark, fitted shirt with the sleeves rolled up, exposing forearms that looked capable, strong. But it was the hair that stopped my breath. The severe bun was gone, released into a cascade of dark blonde waves that caught the candlelight. She was laughing. It wasn't the polite, muted chuckle she had offered in the hallway. This was a full-throated, unguarded sound, her head thrown back, her neck exposed. She was talking to the bartender, who had leaned over the rail, but her attention wasn't fixed. She looked relaxed, expansive, a woman occupying her own space, not maintaining someone else's. The transformation was jarring. In the hotel, she was a function of the building, a ghost who folded towels and vanished. Here, she was the main character. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. I had been looking at her through the lens of a service transaction, but she had been looking at me as a woman. As if she felt the weight of my gaze, she turned. There was no startle response this time, no flinch. Her eyes found mine across the haze of the room, and the connection was instant, tactile. It felt like a cable snapping taut between us. The professional distance, the suture I had relied on to keep our interactions safe and sterile, didn't just fray, it dissolved. She didn't wave. She simply picked up her drink and stood. The way she moved through the crowded room was a revelation. In the hallway, she had been efficient, linear. Here, she was fluid. She navigated the gaps between tables with an easy, athletic grace, never breaking eye contact. She slid onto the stool next to me. The proximity was sudden and overwhelming. Without the barrier of the housekeeping cart, without the uniform, the heat radiating from her felt dangerous. "You found it," she said. Her voice was lower here, pitched to cut through the hum of the bass. "I followed instructions," I replied, gripping my glass. "You said the jazz sounds like it's falling apart." "Listen," she said, leaning in. Her shoulder brushed mine, a deliberate, electric contact that sent a shockwave down my arm. The piano player. He's not following a chart. He's finding the melody as he destroys the rhythm. We sat in silence for a moment, listening. She was right. The music was chaotic, anxious, but beautiful. It mirrored the feeling in my chest. "I didn't recognize you," I admitted, turning to look at her profile. "You look real?" she finished, turning to face me. Her gaze dropped to my mouth, then back up to my eyes, unflinching. "The uniform is just a costume, Riley. It makes people comfortable. They don't want to see the person who cleans their toilet. They want a machine." "I saw you," I said. The words felt heavy, True. You're starting to, she corrected. She took a sip of her beer, the glass condensation slick against her fingers. You're still looking at the map. I'm trying to show you the terrain. She shifted, her knee knocking against mine under the bar. She didn't pull away. Neither did I. The contact was a steady pressure, a grounding wire. Tell me, she said, her voice dropping to a murmur that excluded the rest of the room. What does the architect do when the structure fails? She rebuilds, I said, my voice shaky. No, Ellie said, her eyes dark and serious. She walks out of the ruins. The air between us thickened, charged with everything we hadn't said in the hotel room. The bar, the music, the whiskey, it all faded into the background. There was only the heat of her leg against mine and the terrifying realization that I didn't want to go back to the hotel. I wanted to go wherever she was going. It's getting late, she said, checking her watch, but she made no move to leave. The set is over. I'm not ready to go back, I said. It was a confession. Ellie smiled, a slow, knowing expression that made my stomach flip. Good, because the walk back is the best part. The door of the Blue Jay swung shut behind us, cutting off the chaotic warmth of the jazz and dumping us back into the damp, gray reality of the Seattle night. The silence of the street wasn't empty, though. It was heavy, saturated with the mist that clung to our coats and the unspoken energy that had been building between us for hours. The transition from the smoky, intimate bar to the open air should have cooled things down. Instead, the sudden drop in temperature only made the heat radiating from Ellie more distinct. We walked without a destination in mind, though the gravity of the hotel inevitably pulled us back toward its orbit. The city was a blur of wet pavement and smeared neon, the streetlights reflecting in the puddles like spilled oil. I wasn't looking at the architecture anymore. I was hyper-aware of the rhythm of her boots on the concrete, the way her stride matched mine, a silent synchronization that felt more intimate than holding hands. Every few steps, the sleeve of her jacket brushed against my arm, a friction that sent a jolt of static straight to my chest. It wasn't accidental. It was a conversation occurring entirely in the negative space between our bodies. You're quiet, Ellie said. Her voice was soft, blending with the distant hiss of tires on wet asphalt. She wasn't looking at me. She was watching the steam rise from a manhole cover, her profile sharp and contemplative against the dark. I'm recalibrating, I admitted, tucking my hands deeper into my pockets to hide the fact that they were trembling. In there, it felt easy to forget the logic of things. Out here, the grid comes back. The grid is just lines on a map, she countered, glancing at me sideways. You're the one who decides if you walk on the lines or between them. We turned the final corner and the hotel rose up before us, a monolith of glass and steel, its windows glowing like a hive. The entrance was dominated by the revolving door, a spinning mechanism designed to process people, to filter the chaotic outside world into the sterilized, climate-controlled interior. It looked less like an entrance and more like a checkpoint. I stopped 10 feet from the awning. I couldn't make my feet move toward it. The moment I stepped through that glass centrifuge, I would become the guest again. The armor would snap back into place. The suit would feel like a uniform, and Ellie would become the staff member with the cart. The thought made my stomach turn, a visceral rejection of the status quo. Ellie stopped too. She didn't push me toward the entrance. She turned to face me, the mist catching in the loose waves of her hair, creating a halo of diffused light. She stood with her back to the hotel, as if she were the barrier protecting me from it. You don't want to go in, she stated. It wasn't a question. I don't want to put the mask back on, I said. The confession felt raw, stripped of the polished vocabulary I usually hid behind. The moment I walk through that door, I have to be Riley Carter, the logistics expert. I have to be efficient. I have to be hollow. Ellie stepped closer. The distance between us collapsed until I could smell the rain on her skin and the faint, lingering smoke of the jazz bar. She didn't touch me, but the proximity was a physical weight, The air thickened, charged with a magnetic pull that made the rest of the city fade into background noise. "You think the mask is the hotel?" she asked, her voice low and steady. "Riley, you wore the mask in the bar for the first 20 minutes. You wear it when you sleep. The building doesn't do that to you. You do it." It was a harsh truth, but delivered with a gentleness that disarmed me. She wasn't attacking my defenses. She was simply pointing out that I was the one holding the shield. "I don't know how to put it down," I whispered. "It's been up for a long time." "I know," she said. Her gaze held mine, unflinching, stripping away the last of my pretense. "But tonight, you let it slip. I saw you." The tension peaked, a taut wire humming between us. I wanted her to bridge the gap. I wanted her hands on me, anchoring me to this version of myself before it evaporated in the hotel lobby. But she didn't move. She was waiting for me to make the choice, to acknowledge the pull that had started the moment she walked into my room with a stack of towels. "I don't want this night to end," I said. The words rushed out, desperate and terrifyingly honest. "I don't want to go up to that silent room and listen to the ventilation system. I trailed off, the admission catching in my throat. "What do you want?" Ellie asked. She wasn't teasing. She was demanding clarity. "I want to know what happens when the structure fails," I said, echoing her earlier challenge. A slow smile spread across her face, dangerous and beautiful. "Then don't go to sleep yet. Go upstairs. Wait for me." She stepped back, the loss of her heat hitting me instantly. She nodded toward the side of the building, toward the discreet staff entrance hidden in the alley. "I have to clock out properly," she said, the practical reality crashing back in. But her eyes remained locked on mine. "Go to your room. Leave the door unlocked." She turned and walked away, disappearing into the shadows of the alley without looking back. I stood there for a moment, the rain finally soaking through my coat, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I walked to the revolving door and pushed through. The glass spun, depositing me into the warm, scented air of the lobby. The concierge nodded at me. The night manager smiled his professional smile, but I didn't see them. I moved through the space like a ghost, my mind entirely focused on the promise of the unlocked door upstairs. The elevator ride was a blur of rising numbers, the metal box sealing me in, but for the first time, I didn't feel trapped. I felt like I was waiting for the collision. The morning light was a pale, bruised wash against the glass, but the room still held the static charge of the night before. I hadn't slept, not really. I had spent the hours floating in a state of suspended animation, the kind of restless, electric wakefulness that comes after a fever breaks. The door had been unlocked, yes, and the memory of what passed through it, the whispered conversations, the way the silence between us had finally stopped feeling like a wall and started feeling like a bridge, hung heavy in the air. But morning had brought the inevitable retreat of the staff to the back of house, and I was alone again with the view of the gray skyline. I needed to see her. The urge wasn't a polite request, it was a withdrawal symptom. I picked up the room phone, the heavy receiver cool against my ear. When the front desk answered, cheerful and synthetic, I didn't ask for the manager. I didn't ask for the concierge. "I need housekeeping," I said, my voice steady but low. "Specifically, I need Ellie. There's a discrepancy with the amenities." It was a lie, and a transparent one. In my life in Chicago, I didn't make personal requests of the staff. I didn't learn their names. But the rules of that architecture had dissolved in the rain last night. 10 minutes later, the door clicked. There was no knock this time. The lock disengaged with a green flash, and Ellie stepped inside. She wasn't pushing the cart. She held a small basket of toiletries in one hand, a prop she clearly didn't intend to use. The dynamic had shifted so violently it was almost disorienting. Yesterday, this room had been my sanctuary, a fortress of isolation where I could hide from the world. Now, with her standing in the entryway, the door clicked shut behind her. It felt like a stage. The air thickened instantly, the oxygen replaced by the sheer gravity of her presence. "A discrepancy?" she asked, leaning back against the door frame. Her uniform was crisp again, the mask of the employee back in place, but her eyes were dark, amused, and entirely unguarded. I ran out of clarity, I said, turning my chair to face her. I wasn't sitting at the laptop. The screen was dark, the lid closed. Instead, I was hunched over the coffee table, surrounded by sheets of hotel stationery. I had raided the desk drawer, finding a heavy charcoal pencil in my bag, a relic from a life I thought I had pruned away years ago. My hands were smudged with black dust, the manicured polish ruined by the friction of creation. Ellie pushed off the doorframe and walked toward me. She didn't stop at the respectful distance of a server. She came right to the edge of the table, looking down at the chaotic spread of paper. I hadn't drawn a building. I hadn't drawn a grid. I had sketched the view from the window, but I had stripped away the steel and glass. I had drawn the tension of the city, the way the rain blurred the hard lines, the way the light fought against the gray. It was messy, raw, and deeply structural in a way that had nothing to do with engineering. "You're not drawing the hotel," she observed, her voice quiet. She reached out, her finger hovering over a heavy, dark line of charcoal that slashed across the page. "You're drawing the cage." "I used to do this," I confessed, looking at my stained hands. "Before the mergers, before I decided that stability was more important than breathing, I used to look at a building and see the emotion, not the equity." Ellie sat on the edge of the sofa, her knee brushing against the table, inches from my hand. "The technique is angry," she said. "It wasn't a criticism, it was a diagnosis. You're pressing hard enough to tear the paper. You're trying to force the structure to hold something it can't." I looked up at her. The rain lashed against the window behind us, a rhythmic drumming that sealed us into this private pocket of time. "I feel sutured," I said. The word tasted like metal. "My life in Chicago, it's a series of perfect surgical stitches. I pulled the edges of myself together so tight that nothing could get in. No risk, no mess. But there's no blood flow, Ellie. The tissue is dying." Ellie watched me, her gaze unflinching. She reached out and took the pencil from my hand, setting it down on the table. Then she covered my charcoal-stained hand with hers. Her skin was warm, rougher than mine, grounded in the physical reality of labor. "Sutures are meant to be temporary," she said softly. "They hold the wound until it heals. If you leave them in too long, the body starts to reject them. It gets infected." "I don't know how to cut them," I whispered. "I'm afraid if I pull the thread, the whole thing falls apart." "Let it fall," she said. The challenge was back in her voice, that dangerous, thrilling invitation to chaos. "You don't need the stitches anymore, Riley. You healed a long time ago. You're just scared of the scar." The silence stretched, heavy and sweet. She was right. I was holding on to the pain because it was the only architecture I recognized. "I leave tomorrow," I said, the reality of the timeline crashing into the intimacy of the moment. "Then we don't have time for safety," Ellie said. She stood up, the movement abrupt, breaking the physical circuit, but leaving the energy humming in the air. She walked to the window, looking out at the wet, gray expanse of the roof terrace below, a private sector of the hotel usually reserved for events, currently empty in the drizzle. She turned back to me, her silhouette framed by the storm. "Meet me on the roof tonight," she said. "After the last shift. No guests, no cameras, just the sky." "Is that allowed?" I asked, a reflex of the rule follower I used to be. Ellie smiled, and it was the same smile from the jazz bar, wild and real. "Only if you don't get caught. I have the key. The question is, do you have the nerve?" The service elevator was a distinct departure from the silent, velvet-lined capsules that ferried guests to their suites. It smelled of industrial solvent and cold metal, a utilitarian box that rattled as it climbed the spine of the building. I watched the floor numbers tick upward in red LED, my heart matching the mechanical rhythm. This was the infrastructure, the hidden skeleton that held the luxury up, and for the first time, I felt like I was seeing the building, and myself, honestly. When the doors slid open, the wind hit me first. It wasn't the filtered, climate-controlled breeze of the lobby. It was a gale, wild and untamed, carrying the salt of the Puget Sound and the diesel exhaust of the city below. I stepped out onto the concrete pavers of the roof, the heavy steel door clanging shut behind me, sealing away the hushed propriety of the hotel. The terrace was vast, a flat expanse of wet stone surrounded by a low parapet. The city of Seattle sprawled out in a grid of bioluminescent nerves, the rain turning the streets into rivers of smeared light. It was beautiful, but it was the figure standing at the edge that anchored my focus. Ellie was leaning against the railing, looking out at the dark water of the bay. She wasn't wearing the tunic. She was wrapped in a heavy, darker coat that looked too big for her, the collar turned up against the chill. She didn't turn when I approached. She just tilted her head, acknowledging the sound of my heels on the wet stone. "You came," she said, her voice snatched away by the wind, requiring me to step closer to hear it. "I told you," I replied, stopping a few feet from her. "I want to see the structure fail." Ellie turned then, and the look on her face was stripped of all the playful defiance she had worn in the hallway. Here, under the open sky, she looked serious, almost solemn. The ambient light from the city cast shadows across her cheekbones, highlighting the sharp architecture of her face. "This isn't a failure," she corrected, pushing a strand of wind-whipped hair out of her eyes. "It's a renovation. You have to strip it down to the studs before you can see if the foundation is worth saving." I moved to the railing beside her. The drop was vertigo-inducing, a sheer cliff of glass and steel plunging down to the wet pavement. In Chicago, I lived in a penthouse. I was used to heights, but I was used to experiencing them through triple-paned glass that muffled the world. Here, the danger was immediate. The air was cold, biting at my exposed skin, but the heat radiating from Ellie's side was a tangible force. "I'm terrified," I admitted, the wind tearing the words from my mouth before I could second-guess them. "I go back tomorrow. I pack the suitcase, I put on the suit. I go back to the meetings and the mergers and the silence." "Do you?" Ellie asked. She turned her body fully toward me, blocking the wind, creating a small pocket of stillness between us. "Or do you go back and realize the suit doesn't fit anymore?" "I don't know if I can change it," I said. "The contract is signed. The life is built." "Contracts have exit clauses," she murmured. She reached out, her hand finding the lapel of my coat. She didn't pull me closer, but the weight of her hand was an anchor. "And buildings can be condemned." The metaphor dissolved. We weren't talking about architecture anymore. We were talking about the terrifying, wonderful proximity of our bodies. The distance between us had closed to inches. I could see the flecks of gold in her eyes, the slight part of her lips as she breathed in the cold air. The tension that had been coiling in my chest since the moment she walked into my room with the towels suddenly pulled taut. "I don't want to be hollow," I whispered. "Then let me fill the space," she said. It wasn't a question. It was a calibration. She didn't lunge. She moved with the deliberate, confident grace I had seen when she navigated the crowded bar. Her hand slid up from my coat to the nape of my neck, her fingers tangling in my hair, warm and firm. The contact was electric, a sudden surge of voltage that grounded me instantly. When she kissed me, it wasn't an explosion. It was an alignment. It was two complex systems finally finding the correct frequency. Her lips were cool from the wind, but her mouth was hot, demanding. It was a kiss that tasted of rain and whiskey and absolute certainty. I felt the rigid structure of my defenses, the sutures I had so carefully stitched, snap one by one. I didn't pull away. I pressed into her, my hands finding the waist of her coat, pulling her against me until there was no space left for the wind to cut through. The kiss deepened, becoming unflinching, a silent conversation where she asked for everything I had been hiding, and I gave it to her without hesitation. For a moment, on that wet rooftop above the sleeping city, the logic of my life suspended. There was no flight to catch. There was no board meeting. There was only the pressure of her body against mine, the rough texture of her coat, and the terrifying realization that I had finally, completely, arrived. We broke apart, breathless, our foreheads resting together. The wind howled around us, but I felt steady. "That," Ellie whispered, her voice rough, "is what happens when you stop reading the manual." I looked at her, my lips swollen, my heart hammering a new chaotic rhythm. I knew then that the merger was complete. I wasn't the same woman who had checked in, and I had absolutely no idea how I was going to check out. The morning light felt like an interrogation. I moved through the suite with mechanical efficiency, dismantling the temporary life I had built. My suitcase lay open on the bed like a gaping mouth, swallowing the evidence. I folded the heavy wool coat I had worn on the rooftop. It still held the scent of the salt wind and the faint, smoky trace of Ellie's skin. Sealing it inside the zippered compartment felt less like packing and more like an act of violence, a self-imposed exile back to the sterile safety of the Chicago grid. I took one last look at the room. The bed was stripped, the desk cleared. The charcoal drawing was hidden deep in my carry-on. The space was once again a blank canvas, beige and passive, waiting for the next guest. But the air still felt agitated, the atoms permanently rearranged by the collision that had happened here. I left the keycard on the nightstand. The click of plastic on wood sounded like a gavel dropping. The elevator ride down was a slow suffocation. With every floor that passed, the Riley Carter mask settled heavier onto my face. By the time the doors slid open in the lobby, the armor was fully engaged. My spine was straight, my expression neutral, my phone checking flights. The lobby was a symphony of commerce, rolling luggage, ringing phones, the murmur of transactions. I hated it. I was signing the final bill, the pen feeling foreign in my hand, when the atmosphere shifted. The ambient noise seemed to dampen. I turned. Ellie was standing near the concierge desk. The transformation was complete. The gray tunic was back, shapeless and erasing. Her hair was pulled back into that severe, disciplined bun, not a single chaotic wave escaping. She looked like a component of the hotel's operating system. But then she looked up. The hazel eyes hadn't changed. They held the same unflinching weight they had on the rooftop. She didn't smile. The cameras were watching. The manager was nearby. But the corner of her eye tightened. She walked toward me, the movement efficient, professional, yet charged with a terrifying familiarity. "Ms. Carter," she said. The formality was a jarring dissonance after the way she had whispered my name in the wind. "You left this at the desk." She held out a folded piece of paper. It looked like a standard receipt, but as I reached for it, her fingers brushed mine. The contact was brief, shielded by the paper, but the current was undeniable. A live wire touching a conductor. "We hope you found what you were looking for," she said, her voice flat, but her gaze searing. "I did," I replied, my voice tight. The structure held. "Safe travels, Miss Carter." She stepped back, restoring the professional distance. I turned and walked out into the waiting town car, the paper burning against my palm. The door of the town car thudded shut, sealing me into the hermetic silence of leather and climate control. It was a familiar environment, the mobile office of the executive class, but as the driver pulled away from the curb, merging into the gray stream of Seattle traffic, the space felt foreign. I didn't belong in this vacuum anymore. My skin still hummed with the memory of the wind on the roof. My lungs were still full of the damp, unfiltered air of the alleyway. I looked down at the paper in my hand. It was printed on standard thermal receipt paper, the kind that fades if you leave it in the sun too long. On one side, a list of charges for a room service breakfast I hadn't ordered. I flipped it over. There, in the same jagged, heavy blue ink that had defaced my book, was a sketch. It wasn't a landscape. It was a quick, confident diagram of a support beam snapping under pressure. Underneath, she had written a single line of text. "Demolition is just the first phase of construction. 312-555-0198. My breath hitched. It wasn't a sentimental goodbye. It wasn't a hope to see you again. It was a set of instructions. She had given me her number, yes, but more than that, she had given me permission to tear it all down. I leaned back against the seat, watching the skyline of the city recede through the tinted glass. The fear that had been dogging me all week, the terror of returning to the hollow perfection of my life in Chicago, suddenly evaporated. It was replaced by a terrifying, wonderful clarity. I wasn't going back to resume my life. I wasn't going back to the board meetings, the silent penthouse, the sutures that held my carefully curated existence together. I reached into my bag and pulled out my phone. There was a draft email open to my assistant, a list of tasks to prepare for my return on Monday. I looked at it for a second, the cursor blinking like a heartbeat monitor on a dead patient. Then, I deleted it. I opened a new message. I typed the number from the receipt. "I'm not coming back to visit," I typed, my thumbs moving with a steady, rhythmic cadence. "I'm coming back to pack." I hit send. The message swooshed away, a digital bridge thrown across the distance between the car and the hotel. The vibration of the phone in my hand a moment later wasn't just a notification. It was the first brick of a new foundation. "Good," the reply read. "Bring the sketchbook." I laughed, a sound that startled the driver, who glanced at me in the rearview mirror. I didn't care. The merger was canceled. The acquisition was off. I was going back to Chicago to burn the blueprints, and for the first time in my life, I knew exactly what I was building next. The plane banked hard over the cloud layer, turning east, but gravity had lost its hold on me. I looked down at the white expanse, seeing only the memory of hazel eyes and the promise of a return trip that was already etched in stone. I wasn't leaving. I was just gathering my things. If you've ever found clarity in the most unexpected pair of eyes, subscribe to follow the next chapter of this journey.